Okay, dear members of Har-El and guests, dear guests, good Shabbat. We are delighted to welcome this Shabbat, Friday and Saturday, our dear friend Rabbi Kanter. And before I will invite you to the Bima, I would like to read a bit of your biography. I will start. Rabbi Kehilat A. Kanter is Director of Interfaith and Special Events for the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. For the past 14 years, he served as Associate Dean and Director of the Rabbinical School there. In January of 2019, he became Rabbinic Director of the Society for Classical Reform Judaism, an organization encouraging the historical, liturgical, and social justice heritage of Reform Judaism. In this frame, we are privileged to welcome you, and from now on, to cooperate closely with you. So thank you so much, and we are eager to hear your sermon.
Thank you.
And
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Most of you know the word chutzpah. My new definition is for me to give a talk on music in front of Dr. Eliyahu Schleicher. I cannot think of a less appropriate talk in the presence of my teacher, our teacher, composer, historian, than for me to get up and talk about this stuff, but it is my privilege and pleasure to do so. Not only to have Ellie here today, but to have Dr. Jonathan Sachs write the introduction to my remarks. Rabbi read so beautifully, talking about many of the same people about whom I will speak as part of the gift of the Jewish people to the world. The scientists, the mathematicians, the psychologists, sociologists, composers, painters, and so on. It's a remarkable experience. So let me begin, first of all, by answering a question perhaps that some of you have. Why is a rabbi who served congregations for more than 25 years, now teaching at the Hebrew Union College and an administrator, as I said, as Associate Dean, and now as the Director of the Society for Classical Reform Judaism, what am I doing giving a talk to you on Shabbat in this historic congregation in the front of a man with a magnificent voice and teaching skills way back there, and others of my soon-to-be colleagues from Hebrew Union College, rabbinical program, cantorial program, even a member of my family sitting back there. It's very special to have this opportunity, but I'm going to answer the question you might ask, why is he doing this? And why as in his new role with the society? Well, over the past number of years, my predecessor, Rabbi Howard Berman, has spoken at Har-El in the scholarly and magnificent way that he is so comfortable in doing. And I felt that there was no way I could follow the kinds of scholarship that he represents. So I wanted to give you the scholarship I represent, which is the fact that in rabbinical school at the Hebrew Union College in 1974, when I was here as a student, we were given an assignment, and that was to give a lecture in modern Jewish thought to our students and to the Jerusalem community who might be interested to come here. My classmates gave speeches on great theologians and philosophers and historians. They talked about great Jewish scholarship and Jewish literature. They talked about Agnon and all these other people, and I said to myself, what was the one thing that I knew that no one else in the school knew anything about? And so I gave my lecture in the field of the Jewish contribution to American popular music. The result of that was coming back from Jerusalem, and by the way, I talked, and then I used a piece of technology that is lost to many of you. It was called a cassette recorder. Because I had gone home at the winter break, recorded all the great musicians of the 30s, 40s, 50s, Ethel Merman, Mary Martin, Ezio Pinza, all these great names, put them on my cassette, brought it back with me, and as I talked to everyone and I pressed the button, and then you heard these great performers. The result of this was that the word got out, apparently, in Cincinnati, and they recognized I would be a wonderful entertainment for sisterhood events all around the United States, largely because I charged so little. It was $25 or $50 or $100 plus the travel, and I would be this entertainer. All of that was wonderful until I was invited to the largest conservative synagogue in Cincinnati, more than 1,000 families, a very large congregation, and the rabbi asked me would I lecture or entertain the Golden Agers group of the synagogue, the Kenim, the oldest community. I said, sure, no problem. When would it be? Shabbat afternoon, sort of an Oneg Shabbat. Wonderful. I walk in with my cassette recorder, and he looks at this and says, "Was ist das? What is this?" I said, "It's my whole program." He said, "You cannot use a tape recorder on Shabbat. And more than that, because you didn't come in advance, you can't use the microphone either." We had 400 people at this program, and as I said to someone afterward, the way they could hear and the way I could sing, it was a perfect match. And so it began, this program where I gave just about a 2-hour talk with all the songs a cappella, meaning no accompaniment, just me. The result of that was from then on, all these 40 years later, and touring all around the world, and have now written 3 books, and actually can claim some level of scholarship in the field, I always bring and always have a remarkable pianist or accompanist who unfortunately left right after the service this morning, so it's just us. That's it. So what are we going to do? Lord Sachs talked about the contribution of the Jewish people to the cultural, scientific, historic, and enrichment, intellectual enrichment of the world. And I'm going to share with you that the one area that more people know than maybe any of the others that Rabbi Otter read to you is the role of Jews in American popular music. And world popular music, let me say further. And I've now done these programs, I think, in 20 countries around the world. And it's fascinating whether it is Japan when I was in Tokyo, or in Australia, or in Israel before a number of years ago, or in England, or wherever it is, people know these songs. And what I would like to do with you today, had I warned him in advance, I know that Kanter Evan would have been happy to come up and sing all these songs. I brought you a song sheet in the hope that as we get to a couple of them, maybe we can get not just him to sing, but all of you to sing along, because we have the words and you'll know these songs, I think. But I want to begin by setting an appropriate frame, because we're going to begin with a song. I'm not going to sing it, I'm going to talk about it really, from a musical that was rather unlikely to be a success in New York or anywhere else for that matter, because the story was so problematic about which to write a musical. And the story was based on a series of short stories that came from the collection called I Am a Camera. which were written about pre-war Germany. And how can you make a musical out of a story such as that? Well, John Kanter and Fred Ebb in the 1960s did just that. The musical that they wrote was entitled Cabaret. And in 1966, it was a radical musical theme. It was a story that people felt would never succeed. Because, of course, as I assume most of you, and if you don't know any of these shows, raise your hand or something if you've never heard of these various shows. Because otherwise it doesn't make much sense to talk about them. I think many of you do. It was an Oscar-winning film.
Liza
Minnelli in it originally. So it's a very profound musical. And Joel Grey, right, exactly. Joel Grey, who, by the way, is represented on Broadway as we speak in the Yiddish translation of Fiddler on the Roof, whose royalty we have sitting right back here. What was your role?
I was one of the
Well, you were the
development
original
producers.
Right.
And the original Chava in the reading.
All right, so the Chava in the reading of Joel Grey's Fiddler on the Roof is sitting right here. Did you know that? So, yes, you can do whatever this is. Anyway, in 1966, this musical opened on Broadway, and believe it or not, ran for 1,200 performances. It's been revived twice since then. And just so you know, a performance cycle in Broadway is 400 a year. So there are 400 performances per year. It ran 3 years in its original form. And it brought to the theater this profound music about anti-Semitism, about gender issues, about sexuality issues, in a time that was before that being popular subject matter, or at least even acceptable subject matter. It was toned down from the book and in the movie, but if you had seen the productions later than that, they restored much of the power of the message. John Kanter, a man from Kansas City, United States, is famous for his grandmother. I always give her credit. And she is famous for some of you because she wrote probably the most famous American Jewish cookbook ever written. She is the woman who wrote the Settlement Cookbook. And for those of you of a generation of my mother and grandmother and of that, you will know the Settlement Cookbook. It was in every Jewish woman's house. And I don't know if it traveled around the world, but in America, it always gets a, oh, I got the Settlement Cookbook. I don't know how many of you, just as a show of hands, how many of you do? A couple of you. All right, good. I'm glad it's not, has made it around the world, or you brought it with you when you moved here from wherever. Anyway, John Kanter and Fred Ebb wrote this musical, and it seems appropriate as we begin with it because the opening number sung by Joel Grey was the song Willkommen. Willkommen, you don't even know that was in there. Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome, right? So he begins the show with this Willkommen, welcome to all the people. It is set in a nightclub, and it is a musical that talks of anti-Semitism. There's a Jewish figure, was played by Jack Gilford, if you know that name, but you might know his girlfriend that he hoped he would marry. Her name is Lotte Lenya, and the wife, of course, of one of the great songwriters and lyricists of the 20th century, whose name I think you also should probably know. Who was that? Kurt Weill, exactly. So here was Lotte Lenya in this great musical coming back from retirement to play a character who is a non-Jewish keeper of a hotel. I don't know how you say this less pleasantly, but it's sort of where people rented rooms by the hour.
Sometimes by the
It's not exactly Shabbatic, but I'm trying to do this in an appropriate way. She ran a house of repute, or ill repute as the case may be. Anyway, the point being, she falls in love with the Jewish character. They get attempted to get married, and of course anti-Semitism and the reaction of the Nazis gets in the way. And so that's a sub-story of this musical of Kanter and Ebb of Cabaret. Now it's interesting, even more fully, that the two of these composers, Kanter and Ebb, Kanter's still alive, well into his 90s. He was born in 1927, so he's 92. Still writing, has another show coming out this year. He has a number of younger songwriters with whom he works, and he has one coming up this year. Fred Ebb, who died 15 years ago. But the last musical they wrote was written after Fred Ebb's death, and it was brought out afterward, and it was a very powerful musical. It didn't run very long, but it starred Chita Rivera. And if you know that name, she, of course, was in West Side Story, and she came back in her middle 80s to star in this musical of her friends, Kanter and Ebb. So we begin with Willkommen appropriately, and where do we go? To the next musical that you're all going to know, but that none of you will know the story, because in fact it was about anti-Semitism as well. The year was 1957, and a group of composer, lyricist, director, choreographer all got together. What did they all have in common? They were all Jewish. Leonard Bernstein, Jerome Robbins, Harold Prince, Stephen Sondheim. They got together to write a musical. Actually, it was 1956. The show came out in 57. 1956, they decided to write a musical about a Jewish girl and a Gentile Catholic boy who fall in love. But the girl's parents don't like the boy's parents don't like the girl, and then they decided that story is so trite, and it was called, by the way, Lower East Side Story. True. Because the girl lived in the Lower East Side. The Jewish girl whose parents are immigrants to the Lower East Side. She falls in love with this Polish Catholic boy, and they decide it's too trite. We're not going to do a musical on that story. It's been a play already. If you're a longtime theater fan, you might be familiar with a play that was called Abbey's Irish Rose. And Abbey's Irish Rose was, at the time, the longest running play ever on Broadway, about Abbey the Jew and the girl he falls in love with, whose name is an Irish girl named Rose. So he falls in love, and they said, this is too trite, we're not going to do this. They put the story away for a year. Until in New York City in the late 50s, there were riots between the Hispanic community and the Anglo community, and they said, wait a minute, we're going to move the story from the Lower East Side to the West Side, and we'll change the Jewish girl and the Catholic boy, and we'll make them Puerto Rican and American. And up came this show, which you know as West Side Story. West Side Story, in its original form, taking place in a completely different neighborhood, but they kept most of the same music. They did change some of the scenes, like, for example, in the gymnasium, that wonderful dance sequence, because it's very Puerto Rican in style, at least that's what Bernstein thought. But the fact being that most of the songs were pretty much able to be changed, to be put in there. And the song you're most familiar with, I would imagine, from West Side Story, is also in the song sheet. We can do a little just so you get the taste of it. Tonight won't be just any night. Tonight there will be no morning star. Tonight, I'll see my love tonight, and for us stars will stop where they are. Today the minutes seem like hours, the hours go so slowly, and still the sky is light. Oh, That's it. I know. Cantors, rabbis, and then there's Eli. I don't know how to I really want a photograph of him singing Broadway, but that's a memory I will always have for years.
We have camera.
Yeah, right. I was doing a program years ago in Nashville, Tennessee, and this elderly gentleman comes up to me and he says, "Rabbi, I want to thank you for all of the nice things you said about my father." Oi, who is this guy? He hands me his business card. Al Jolson Jr. Al Jolson Jr., who is the son of Ruby Keeler and Al Jolson, who lives in Nashville and of all the unlikely things, writes country music. But he had come to the show because he saw what I was doing, and anyway, it's not exactly as wonderful as having Ellie here, but it's pretty close. Al Jolson Jr. All right, we're going to go back in history, because those first two were just examples of the Broadway musical of which we speak. But we're going to move back to the greatest operetta composer of American history. He was Hungarian. He moved to Vienna to study engineering, by the way, in about 1890 something or other. And in 1909, he moves to America and gives up his engineering degree, gives up his parents' approval, and comes to New York to write operetta, as he had done in Europe. His name, Sigmund Romberg. And Sigmund Romberg, who was arguably, along with two or three others, of the greatest of the 19th century Middle European composers who came to America and to write music and to write operetta. His most famous was called The Student Prince. And if you are in the appropriate mood, you will remember the drinking song from The Student Prince. So if you're holding up, it can be beer if you're Viennese, or your Kiddush cup on Shabbat, and it's drink, 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 to eyes that are bright as stars when they're shining on me. Now, this was an instant generation gap. I'm watching Ellie and a few others going, "Oh, I know that one." And I'm looking at the rabbinical students saying, "Never heard of that stuff at all." This whole show is, in fact, this lecture, this presentation, is a generation gap. And some of them you'll know, this one you won't. But let's see how good you are remembering early movie musicals, and ask you who was the star of The Student Prince, the tenor, by the way, little bitty guy. Anybody know? I'll give you another clue. He was known as his nickname was the singing truck driver, if that helps any. Mario Lanza, exactly right. Who knew that? Where was it? Aha! All right. A clue. He not only comes up and participates in services, he remembers Mario Lanza. So Mario Lanza was the original star, and in the movie, I think he was a little over 5 feet tall. And so every movie he was in, he stood on a wooden box, so he could be the same height as the women he was performing with. But Mario Lanza was in The Student Prince, but amongst Sigmund Romberg's other shows or songs was the song When I Grow Too Old to Dream. You know that one? When I grow too old to dream, I'll have you to remember. Some great songs. But now I want you to turn to the back of your song sheet. And you will see reproduced a musical that you probably never heard of called Sinbad. The year was 1919. And if you look at the composer, you'll see it was Sigmund Romberg. But you'll see next to it, both above the title and listed as co-music creator, Al Jolson. Now, Al Jolson, of course, who did not write these songs, but who demanded listing in this way, because in those days, if you were given credit for writing a song, you were more likely to sing it and therefore sell more copies. So here was Jolson above the title and listed as songwriter, but Al Jolson, Asa Jolson, by the way, his real name, had a somewhat bad habit, shall we say. And that was, whatever show he was in, he would walk down to the front of the stage and tell the cast, you all sit down. Because no one in this audience came to see you dance and sing, they came to see me. Which was probably right, actually, because most of the shows in which he was the star weren't terribly good. But Al Jolson had the very bad habit of interpolating songs he liked better than the ones in the show in which he was starring. And the song he introduced into Sinbad of 1919 was George Gershwin's first great hit, called Swanee. And Swanee was introduced by Jolson into Sigmund Romberg's show without, number one, getting permission from Gershwin, and number two, asking Sigmund Romberg. Tragically, the only song we still know from this score is Swanee. The Romberg score is completely gone. We're going to move forward. I'm watching the clock. 1917. The United States finally joins the allies of England and France and enters World War I. 1917, one of the greatest songwriters of America, so famous that he was mentioned by Rabbi this morning in the words of Lord Sachs. His name, Israel Beilim. Born in the Pale of Settlement in Russia, came to America in the Lower East Side where he became a singing waiter. Wrote his first show very, very early in the 20th century, but his first famous show that you've ever heard of probably is the one we're going to talk about now. He couldn't play piano. He only knew how to play the black keys, the key of F sharp. But he had something that every musician wants. It was a crank on his piano that could transpose into any key he needed, even though he would play the same keys, the black keys. He was a self-taught musician, wrote his first song called Marie from Sunny Italy in 1907, and it earned 37 cents in royalty, which in 1907 wasn't much then, as it isn't much now. In 1912, he wrote his first million seller, called Alexander's Ragtime Band. And that song really created Irving Berlin's beginning career, so much so that in 1917, and this is how I finally get back to the story, he was drafted into the army. But because of his wealth and his fame, he brought his valet with him, his butler, his servant. He took this servant with him to the center of military activity in America's role in the war, Long Island, New York, in a community called Yaphank, New York, and the military base was Camp Upton. And why am I telling you this? Because in 1917, Irving Berlin went to the commanding officer and said to him, look, I hate this military stuff, I hate the uniforms, I hate getting up, I hate the food, I hate all of it. If you let me write a show to raise money for a social hall for the enlisted soldiers, can I get out of the military stuff? And the commanding officer, being a wise person, said, of course. Irving Berlin wrote a show that you've never heard of, most likely, called Yip Yip Yap Hank. But it had some famous songs in it. And one of them, I think it's in the song sheet, and if you're old enough and familiar enough to these, let's see here. No, it's not in the song sheet. I'll just have you sing it and see if you know it. It goes like this. I'll do it from the chorus. Oh, how I hate to get up in the morning. Oh, how I'd like to remain in bed. But the hardest blow of all is to hear the bugler call. You gotta get up, you gotta get up, you gotta get up this morning. I told you, Generation Gap. That's great. 1917 was this show, and it's fascinating historically for all of you people interested in history. Irving Berlin is the first man to integrate the United States Army. Because in 1917, this show went to Broadway. They set up tents right near Times Square, Herald Square, earlier, a little further south. And Berlin said, if these soldiers are going to sing and perform together on the stage, then they're going to live in the same tents and in the same facilities. And he required that the soldiers be integrated, and it's the first time that ever happened. And that's World War I. It's a fascinating thing. We're going to move forward to the period of 1930. And I should include 1927. I'm going to mention it because it's so important. If you remember no other year from this presentation in terms of the accomplishment of Jewish artists, this is a year to remember. And I'm going to give you 3 names, and I bet you'll know before I finish them about what we're speaking. Number 1, Jerome Kern. Number 2, Oscar Hammerstein II. And number 3, Edna Ferber. Now those names should mean something to you because together they wrote the first great musical where the singing, the dancing, the music, the libretto all worked together into a show that became historically important, and as you said already, the musical was Showboat. What was the storyline? The storyline was of a showboat, which is like a traveling theater that went down the Mississippi River from places ending in New Orleans, it hoped to. And this was a period of the issue of mixed race, or as it was called in the show, miscegenation, where a black person had the blood of a white person as well. In other words, they were married in this case, and in this one sequence where the white male figure, Ravenel, stabs his finger and mixes the blood with his wife, so they become mixed blood or mixed race, which was not legal in the states of Mississippi and a couple of the other states that the riverboat traveled. And this is the storyline of a musical 90-something years ago. It's quite remarkable. The book, a Jewish author, meaning Edna Ferber. The lyrics, Oscar Hammerstein, Jewish, on one side of the family, not his mother, so I guess with matrilineal descent he wasn't Jewish, but his own tradition he was, and he was buried at his death at a synagogue, so there was that connection. And of course, Jerome Kern, whose life, he was a Jew all the way through in his family, and this is Showboat of 1927. One of the reasons I don't put this in the normal program is that the most famous song from Showboat is something, of course, that I can't sing. But if I had some great voices, or maybe a baritone or a bass, that would help. Because Old Man River is very hard if you're sort of like...
You need a real bass voice.
Yeah, a real bass voice, and I'm not it, let us just say. But we're going to move forward to another genre, and this is the theater of the 1930s. And when we get to it, we're going to actually do this one, because you're going to know a lot of these. And we're going to talk about Irving Berlin in a little bit. What time are we supposed to be done? What's Martin?
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock. I will never, not only never get invited again, they'll never let me in the country. But anyway, the year is 1930. And here is one of the great esoteric cultural storylines you've ever heard. A boy falls in love with the girl. The girl's parents don't like the boy. So they send her to a dude ranch in Arizona. Like right, you know what a dude ranch, a ranch, right, with cows. Okay. The boy's parents don't like the girl. So what do? They send him to a dude ranch in Arizona. Now that is stupid enough as a storyline, but let me tell you who worked at the dude ranch. The postmistress of this community was a young lady by the name of Ginger Rogers. The lead counselor at this dude ranch was another young woman getting her Broadway start. Her name, Ethel Merman. the band, I don't know if any of you were jazz people, but listen to the pit band in 1930. Glenn Miller, Gene Krupa, Tommy Dorsey, and Benny Goodman. All of them in one band for the same show. That's right, playing music of George and Ira Gershwin.
Is any of it recorded?
Yes, yes. There's I don't know if it's the band there, but there's Ethel Merman recorded. Remember, 1930, it's before shows were recorded. The first show to be recorded was Oklahoma. Before that, they had people recording songs, but they didn't do original cast. Anyway, the storyline that made Ethel Merman a star, I'm quite sure I've got it in here. It's in the middle of the page. And so all of the women in here who can sing better than I do, which is probably most of you, this is your number, because it's the song entitled I Got Rhythm from this musical, Girl Crazy of 1930. So, let's see, should we do it from the chorus part, the famous part? You ready? I got rhythm, I got music, I got my man, who could ask for anything more? I got daisies in green pastures, I got my man, who could ask for anything more? Old man trouble, I don't mind him, you won't find him round my door. I got starlight, I got sweet dreams, I got my man, who could ask for anything more? Who could ask for anything more? Very nice. Oh no, it's this. Oh, this? Yeah, right. All right, anyway.
Variation of Jacob's Camp.
Right. So George and Ira Gershwin, whose by the real names were Jacob and Izzy Gershowitz, but they became Americanized as Gershwin and then Gershwin. Both of them born in the 1890s. Ira a little bit older, 1896, and George 1898. Tragically for all of us, Gershwin died in 1935. George did, of a brain tumor. His brother Ira lived until in 1983, lived a very long life. I had the pleasure of shaking his hand once, but that was it. But it was a thrill to, not as much as, but you, it was a grand opportunity to meet him. They only wrote, in the 30-something shows that they did write, only 3 hits. Only 3 shows made money. It's fascinating. And of those 3, Strike Up the Band, Of Thee I Sing, and the operetta, Porgy and Bess, which, by the way, wasn't a success. In the first twice or 3 times it was revived, because they couldn't figure out what it was. Is it an opera, which the Broadway people didn't like? Is it a Broadway show, which the opera people didn't like? And only by the 3rd or 4th revival did they say, what difference does it make? It's still great. And by the way, it has been revived over and over and over again. Well, we're going to move a few years after that to another set of composers that I haven't mentioned to you before, and that is Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart. Not Hammerstein, he's coming later. He and Rodgers don't work together until 1943 in Oklahoma, but they both wrote separately. Lorenz Hart, Richard Rodgers, both Jews, of course. Interestingly, many of these songwriters knew each other from summer camp. They had all gone to camp together in the Catskills, and that included Hammerstein. Stephen Sondheim's father, Herbert Sondheim, was at camp with Hammerstein, Richard Rodgers, Lorenz Hart. It's remarkable. And if they didn't know themselves there, they went to college together at Columbia and wrote shows together. So it's a very small, tight little group. But Rodgers and Hart wrote so many of these great shows. They wrote 26 shows together. And amongst the songs that you would probably know, Falling in Love with Love is falling for make-believe, or This Can't Be Love because I feel so fine, right? Or another one, My Funny Valentine, Sweet Funny Valentine. Well, one of the songs that they wrote from a show that's plot is so stupid, it's embarrassing, but you'll all know it because it became a movie. And the story is the kids in the neighborhood who are all poor, it's the Depression, it's 1937, and they say, let's get together and write a show. Now that's helpful when Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland live in your neighborhood. And that is the storyline of the musical Babes in Arms. That's the whole plot. It's not exactly anything that you're going to love, but it does have one great song in it that you will find in your song sheet, and it's entitled, That's Why the Lady is a Tramp. How many of you know that song? I figured as much. All right, here we go. She gets too hungry for dinner at 8. She likes the theater, but never comes late. She never bothers with people she hates. That's why the lady is a tramp. Good enough. You got a good sense of this. I'm watching the clock tick. And all of you are saying, wait a minute, I got lunch, and soon it'll be dinner, so we don't want to do that to you. Anyway, I'm going to mention another of the great songwriters because I've already talked about his wife. Lotte Lenya, of course, her name, and his name, Kurt Weill. Now, he's not known for Broadway musicals, although he wrote several of them. But the most famous one he wrote was a less likely storyline, and that was writing about New Amsterdam in the 1600s. And the musical was entitled Knickerbocker Holiday. And it had one great song in it that most of people know. It's not in the song sheet because I often don't do it, but I wanted to tell his story a little bit, because Kurt Weill was born in 1900 and died in 1950. He was born in East Germany. He was the son of a Chazan, as were many of these songwriters. More of the Tin Pan Alley songwriters, which is a whole different program, but many of them were the sons of Jewish music professionals and took that into American popular music. Kurt Weill, unlike Irving Berlin, studied with the greatest of the musical teachers of Europe. His family was wealthy, and he came from some level of success. And he wrote, amongst other things, the Three-Penny Opera that you're familiar with, the great opera first in German and then done in America. But one of the things you don't know, most likely, except a few of you, was that he wrote with Franz Werfel, one of the great anti-war, pro-Jewish theatrical events of the 1930s, when he wrote a show called The Eternal Road, which, by the way, is recorded. So it's Weill's music, Werfel's lyrics, and it's about the great history of the Jews from the time of the Bible to his modern time in the 1930s. It was a remarkable production done in New York City at Madison Square Garden, as a matter of fact, and was a huge success, very interesting. But the song that came from Knickerbocker Holiday that some of you might know is called the September Song. You know that one? Oh, it's a long, long while from May to December. Anyway, we're not going to sing the whole number. Next time I come, we'll do it with a piano, maybe, and with real singers. Another reality is that even the greatest songwriters can write flops, can write catastrophes. And one of them was the two greatest songwriters individually of the 20th century, Jerome Kern and his partner at that time, Oscar Hammerstein II. They wrote a musical that ran on Broadway for exactly 6 weeks until it failed. It was entitled Very Warm for May. And judging by your enthusiastic response, you don't know it either. But it did have one great song, a song that some of you will still know. It's entitled All the Things You Are. Remember that one? The famous part, you are the, words here? You are the promised kiss of springtime that makes the lonely winter seems long. I mean, how many of you know that one? A few of you do. Really? Okay, good. I'm glad. That gets us to the next key year, for you to remember. What was the first one? 1927. Second one, 1943, when Oklahoma opens on Broadway. And what's interesting about it is Richard Rodgers had been writing with Lawrence Hart. Oscar Hammerstein had been writing with Jerome Kern. Neither Hart nor Kern wanted to write this, what they thought, corny musical about Oklahoma in the 19th century, early 20th century. So Hammerstein and Rogers got together and said, we're going to do one show. Just this one. Not to worry, we'll go back with our partners after that. Well, Hart was already ill. He was an alcoholic and was no longer writing. Kern was ill, but he didn't know how ill he was till very soon after this story. Hammerstein and Rogers wrote this musical owned by the Theater Guild called Green Grow the Lilacs. They changed it from Europe, from the British Isles, to Oklahoma. Quite a change, shall we say? And of course, by the way, it's opening on Broadway this season. Now is a new iteration of it that I don't know how Rogers would have liked what they changed, but Hammerstein would, who was quite a liberal in his thinking. But it ran on Broadway, 2,200 performances, and brought to us Alfred Drake and Celeste Holm in their first Broadway successes, and of course began the beginning of the single most successful team that ever wrote for Broadway. And they opened their story in this musical in a unique way. There was no overture, there were no dancing girls, there was no nothing. It was an empty stage, and downstage was one guy, one person, at a butter churn. And in comes the lead man who sings the song, "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." And that started the show, opened the show. Fascinating when it opened in New Haven. One of the reviewers came to see it. You know him because he donated a very beautiful and very famous sculpture garden to Israel. Who was that? Billy Rose. And Billy Rose wrote a review of this that said, no girls, no sets, no chance. He was wrong. Prescient, yes, he was wrong. The show, of course, was the first of what became this string of all but 3 successful shows for Rogers and Hammerstein. And they're so well known, I'm going to move to the next one just 3 years later. This time, Rogers and Hammerstein already had all the money in the world from writing Broadway shows, so now they decided to produce one. And they went to the greatest songwriter of the 20th century, other than themselves, and said, Jerome Kern, would you write me a musical? Write us a musical. We'll produce it. And we want you to write it about the greatest lady sharpshooter in the history of America. Her name, of course, was Annie Oakley. And where did she live? Cincinnati, Ohio. I always throw that one in for all of you who aren't going to the Cincinnati campus. Anyway, except one of you who's from Cincinnati, so Sammy gets a bye on it. Anyway, they go to Kern, who begins to write this score. Tragically, he collapses on the street in New York. He has no wallet with him. He has no identification. He is picked up as a penniless vagrant, taken to a charity hospital in New York until someone finds out who he is, because he does have his ASCAP membership card, the American Society of Composers, Artists, and Producers. He has license number 2, because he and George M. Cohan and Irving Berlin were the founders of ASCAP. And they identified who he was. Tragically, he died. So here are Rogers and Hammerstein producing their very first musical. They have costumes, sets, libretto. By the way, who wrote the libretto? Dorothy and Herbert Fields. Dorothy Fields, who was a songwriter in her own right with Jerome Kern, and wrote, among other things, Sweet Charity, if you're familiar with that, but wrote some of the greats. I Can't Give You Anything But Love, Baby, she wrote in the 20s. Anyway, the point being, she and her brother Herbert wrote the libretto. They had everything written but what? The songs, the music. So they said, what can we do? And they went to the greatest songwriter living, but who hadn't had a hit for 25 years, named Irving Berlin. And he says, the boys, give me the weekend. Let me see what I can do. And over the weekend, he came back with, I got the sun in the morning and the moon at night. Anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you. And he wrote, There's No Business Like, all in one weekend. He plays the songs for Rodgers and Hammerstein, who are struck dumb, I guess is the only thing to say. And there's no reaction, and he says to them, was that good enough? And they said, Irving, that was good enough. That was fine. And of course, Berlin went on to write this show that ran just short of 1,200 performances, made a huge star out of Ethel Merman, and was the greatest of the successes that Irving Berlin wrote on Broadway. But we're going to ask you to go and see There's No Business Like Show Business, which is in your song sheet, and you're bound to know this one. We're getting closer to most of our ages with this show in the 1940s, or at least that we're familiar with. But we'll just do a little bit, because I know we're getting close. And here's how it goes. There's no business like show business, like no business I know. Everything about it is appealing, everything the traffic will allow. Nowhere can you get that happy feeling when you are stealing that extra bow. Okay, stop there. We got to keep moving. All right. 1950. This is going to take some magic in your mind. I want you to think of, actually don't think of me, but think of a set with a young woman with 3 dancers alongside of her in feather boas. The name is the musical rather, is Guys and Dolls. And of course the composer and lyricist Frank Lesser, one of the few who were wrote both the music and the lyrics, along with Berlin, Sondheim, but you could name them pretty much on one hand, Cole Porter being another of the great ones. And that the Hot Box Cafe had Vivian Blaine singing A Bushel and a Peck, which on another day we'll get to do together. We're going to keep moving now because I can't get finished without talking at least briefly about Alan J. Lerner and Fritz Loewe, whose most famous Broadway show is running right now on Broadway, called My Fair Lady. They also wrote Brigadoon. They also wrote Camelot. They also wrote Gigi, if you happen to like old movies, which became an unsuccessful musical, but some wonderful songs. They wrote American in Paris. They wrote some extraordinary composition work. Actually, Lerner wrote words to American in Paris. Loewe was not part of it. And then they also wrote On a Clear Day You Can See Forever and The Little Prince. And I mentioned My Fair Lady to you because it's one of the few Broadway musicals that mentions Jews in them. And not necessarily in a favorable way, even though they are both Jews, because the lyric is, and the Hebrews do it, write it backwards, which is absolutely frightening, which is why can't the English teach their children how to speak. It does mention Hebrews, not necessarily nicely. All right, 1950s. I can do this in 5 minutes. Can you hold on 5 minutes? All right, I don't want you to miss out on some great names, because all of you who come from English background, I don't mean American, the great English Jewish American songwriter Julie Stein is a composer who wrote many, many shows, but most importantly to our story was the musical Gypsy, which many people consider the single greatest musical ever written. That remains to be seen. Rodgers and Hammerstein thought it was King and I mean, they all have their own examples. But Gypsy, Ethel Merman, the storyline completely inappropriate for a synagogue on Shabbat, but it's about a stripper and her mother, who was the traditional theater mother, if you will, who is pushing her daughters into being the stars she never got to be. And of course, from that score is the musical, the song Everything's Coming Up Roses, which was one of the great numbers. And we're going to conclude, not historically, but story-wise, with this last one. The musical, the year I should say, is 1964. In New York City in 1964 was the World's Fair. And for the World's Fair, these two songwriters got together to write a musical. The story they picked was based on Sholem Aleichem, the story of these short stories about this milkman and his daughters and his rather annoying wife and the shadchan in the town. Anyway, all these different things. They write the story. No one will pay the money to produce it. Who would want to go see a musical about a guy who has all these daughters and talks to the top of the theater for most of the show? Amazingly, knowing Israel, who ultimately put up the money? The Pepsi-Cola company. The Pepsi-Cola company that folded under the Arab boycott, but they invested their money into this musical called Fiddler on the Roof. It's fascinating. If you were a regular angel who invested in Fiddler on the Roof, you would have gotten a 20-to-1 payback. And it's still being revived, as it is right now, as you know. Anyway, the musical ran originally 3,200 performances, 8 years. It has been revived over and over and over now in Yiddish, as you heard, with Chava sitting right here. I did see 2 of the worst performances ever given that I actually paid for. I saw Harvey Fierstein, if you know who he is, playing Tevye. He also could have played Golda if he wanted to. Because, of course, he was on Broadway later doing Hairspray as the female character. But I saw Rosie O'Donnell, who most of you who've been here more than 5 years have never heard of, but she was golden. It was excruciatingly terrible, but it's some degree of yichus that you can say you saw that, so I did get to see it. Anyway, I'm going to give you the last story as we conclude, because it proves what Lord Sachs said in the reading that the Rabbi Ida did at the beginning. The United States Information Agency decided that they were going to send a musical around the world because it was so uniquely and typically American. And what did they pick? Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof opened in Russia, went to Poland, then Europe, and closed in Tokyo at huge success. And in the Tokyo newspaper, received a rave review. And the reviewer said, "We cannot understand why Fiddler on the Roof is so popular in America, because the story is so Japanese." So let me simply close by saying we've left out almost as much as we've put in. But what I hope is that it's a little taste, a little tongue of the contribution that American Jews, that Jews from Eastern Europe, who are almost all of them, at least first-generation immigrants, if not immigrants themselves, brought to America and to the world. The music, the lyrics, the message, the chokhmah, the wisdom that these people shared with us. And the truth is, the stories are so Jewish, but so Italian and Japanese and German and Russian and Polish and Israeli and everything else. So with that, Toda Rabba, Shabbat Shalom.
You brought us a leader from Great America, and we are looking forward to your next lecture to us next time. Shabbat Shalom,
Of course you did.